The first thing I think it's important to say to everybody is that bringing in a consultant can be one of the best decisions you make for your nonprofit. It could also be, truth be told, one of the worst. And the difference really depends on the process you use to identify, engage, work with, and even end your relationship with the consultant or the firm that we're talking about. So I want to get into a lot of those kinds of topics that relate to all this. And it's important to know that we are more and more living in what folks are calling a gig economy. So people have what they call side hustles or things that they do to make either extra income or flip into a full-time income job back and forth. And so you're going to encounter this more and more in your nonprofit work. But let's get started here. First of all, I thought it would really be helpful to talk about just what is a consultant. Let's define this a little bit here, right? And like I say here, the word is fraught. People have all sorts of definitions, but we're going to split hairs a little bit here. A lot of folks will just say, well, if you're just giving advice, then you're a consultant, and that's what consultants are. Other people would say, if you're completing a project of some sort, you're a freelancer, a contractor. If you're in sales, selling usually a more physical product, you're a vendor, but sometimes, software and all that too, right? But for our purposes, it's all the same. We're just going to call them all consultants because, your vendor, the person who might be selling you some physical or intangible product, they look at themselves sometimes as consultants because it's consultative sales. They're actually bringing information to you as part of that sales process. So I think it's important that we just kind of cover all these under that same blanket, and you can make these differences as you move ahead in your own work. So who are real jobs, right? And there's always a little bit of suspicion, well, gosh, why are you doing this instead of going someplace? And there are a lot of reasons, which actually for consultants makes it really hard to distinguish themselves because they may not be or may be one of these kind, and it kind of impacts how you work with them sometimes. So starting off, there's a lot of folks who are between paycheck jobs, right? They're in transition. They either don't feel comfortable saying that they're in between jobs. Personally, I think embrace it. And certainly in the fundraising field, there's less and less issues about being in transition. But regardless, some people like to call themselves consultants in between and might even pick up a job or two as they are between different places. And for some people, it actually is a pathway to a permanent position, being a consultant. So that's a good thing for them. Other people need a change of pace. Maybe they've really been in an intense situation for a long time. And not to say that consulting isn't intense, but it's certainly different than a regular paycheck job. And they drop out of their paycheck job and get into something that is a little bit different. There are a lot of trailing spouses in the consulting world. These are people who are married to somebody where they've moved and they take that one of the bread earners takes a job in a different city or something like that, and this person does consulting to kind of get them into the economy there, or maybe just permanently stays that way. There are a fair amount of people who need a flexible schedule, and I think we see this more and more. Of course, there's kind of traditional childcare responsibilities, but then also what I'm seeing is a lot of folks with special needs, children, often not necessarily minor children, but sometimes adult children they have to take care of or monitor, and elder care. That's a big one that I see a lot of, is folks are in consulting because they have the flexibility to deal with a parent or somebody older in their family. And, a lot of folks just always want to be a consultant, and that's a great thing. They are naturally inclined to take a broad set of skills and apply it in a number of places, and that's good. They like to work for themselves. That's always a positive attribute for consultants, but people get into and affect their own business, and especially if they've had family, families with businesses in them. They might enjoy the lifestyle. I have to confess that listening to the traffic reports on the radio while I am at my office at my house is one of the my life's pleasures. um, and they might also have another income of some sort, and whether it's a part-time job or retirement income. For a while, years ago, I was working with people who had military pensions, and so they weren't that old, but they were officially retired and doing other things. So why would you need to call a consultant? And this is really important to think of right up, and we're going to kind of come back to this theme a little bit as we move forward here. But when a problem or situation is simply painful, you got to take care of it now, and you don't have the expertise there. When you see the need for some short-term expertise you may not need over time, think of somebody coming in to fix your computers. For traditional consultant tasks like campaign feasibility studies, that's a traditional consultant task. When your staff is at maximum output, I've certainly had clients who say, I do a lot of writing. And they'll say, gosh, my staff just doesn't have time to do this, so they'll farm it out to somebody else. Or when you need temporary help to meet some service demand, that's certainly a time when you need a consultant. And yet, as a nonprofit, you have some other options. And the first thing you need to ask yourself is, can I do this in-house, right? Maybe, maybe not. Do you have staff in place? Maybe you don't have the skill sets in-house, or maybe that skilled person is overworked. I just mentioned something like that. Do you need a different perspective? Everybody's always been doing the same thing the same way, and you need to get some other way in your place to look at that. Or maybe the job is temporary in nature, and you really don't want to take somebody off task to kind of get them off focus and then refocus them and all that. You could hire somebody new. And really, a lot of times, especially in long-term consulting assignments, you see folks kind of weighing this back and forth. So you might think about, bringing somebody in new, but there's a whole set of HR issues that comes with that, and a commitment that you might not want to make. I mean, there's an ongoing expense. Like I said, have to go through the HR process. And then if it's a project-based thing, once it's done, do you keep the person or not? So that can have its issues. Now, for a nonprofit in particular, you could say, well, why don't I use a volunteer? And, unlike businesses, you have that option. Of course, the question is, can you identify a volunteer and who has that skill set that you need for the particular project you're doing? And that can, it's not just kind of going and picking up somebody off the street and saying, hey, can you do this? You need something done in a particular way, has a background of expertise. So a volunteer may or may not be able to handle that for you. You might have political reasons, internal, like organizational political reasons. You don't want to use a volunteer. You actually might be restricted by contracts with unions and others who may not, for certain jobs, allow you to take in volunteers. And maybe there's some conflict of interest there. So volunteers may or may not be the solution for you. Now, why a consultant instead of an employee, right? I mean, we talk a little bit about that, but I mean, like I said, it could be a temporary project. And do you bring somebody in and you have to let them go or not? You have unemployment and those sort of things. You can, with a consultant, have a low commitment level. So you can hire somebody pretty quickly. Sometimes that goes outside the HR process, and you can shed them pretty quickly. So you're not kind of embracing this person as a full member of the staff. And then budget restrictions. It's interesting. I find a lot of times, and certainly when my time in the paycheck job world was that consultants often did not fall under the same budget restrictions as my staff. So it's not going to be in payroll. And if you only have so much payroll money, but you can spend on a consultant from another line, it might be easier to bring that person in. And sometimes consultants are kind of considered like equipment, where you can bring them in and then use them and then sell them and in fact move them out. But all this also, it's important to ask yourself, what kind of work are you looking for a consultant to do? That's going to impact a lot of how you're going to handle this whole process.